The best way to address issues of security is to have your business be so deeply embedded in the local community that the local community perceives your business as their business, and so they protect it as their own.
I'm Raj Kumar, and you're in the Devex Book Club. Today I'm speaking with Viva Ona Bartkus, whose most recent book, co-authored with Emily Block, is Business on the Edge: How to Improve Lives and Turn a Profit in the World's Toughest Places. By The Edge, Bartkus and Block are talking about the most challenging places to do business on Earth. Places where poverty and violence reinforce each other and keep many global investors and businesses out. The case they make is simple. There is a $20 trillion economy in these so-called frontline markets. If they can be connected to the global market, they and the people who live there can thrive. Viva Ona Bartkus is a business professor who started out her career as a McKinsey consultant, rising to be one of the youngest female partners there. Today, she teaches at Notre Dame's Mendoza College of Business, where she developed one of the most popular classes, a class which brings business students to the front lines, as she calls it, where they can apply some of the same business techniques she learned at McKinsey, but in the most challenging environments. Welcome, Viva. It's great to have you here. Congratulations on the book. It's such a pleasure to get to spend some time with you. Maybe we could just start with what drew you to the topic. Why did somebody who had such an incredible career, you were a Rhodes Scholar, you were one of the youngest female partners at McKinsey, you were kind of on the rise in the world of business. Why did you decide to start working in some of these really challenging places?
Thank you, Raj, for the question. Rebuilding societies ravaged by war and poverty, I think, is really one of the great challenges of the 21st century. And honestly, this is my second time around in these places. So my first time around, as a doctoral student at Oxford, I studied wars of self-determination. So I spent 4 years of my life traipsing around with insurgents and guerrillas in places that were pretty tough. You can think about it as Tibet or Kurdistan, or with the Karen and Kachin in Burma or South Sudan, and got a real feel for the aspirations of these communities. I then went to McKinsey and Company and spent 10 years serving clients. And if you're really at the height of the American economy, you cannot not be impressed with just the sheer dynamism and energy of business. And as I thought about these places that I had spent 4 years of my life studying, what's really striking is the absence of business. And so when we started the Business on the Front Lines program at the University of Notre Dame, the real challenge was, in this jigsaw puzzle that is post-conflict, deep poverty, societies ravaged by these challenges, how do you put business into that jigsaw puzzle? Because I knew from my time at McKinsey and also my time beforehand that there really is a great deal of dignity in a good day's work. And that was really absent in many of these places. And so the thought became, how do we introduce it?
Yeah, of all the things you could have studied in grad school and all the places you could have gone to do this kind of PhD research, why was this interesting to you at the time?
Well, I think that many of life's paths are not necessarily straight. They may be meandering. And my family is from Lithuania in Eastern Europe. And I was in graduate school just as the Berlin Wall fell and as my parents' homeland was regaining its independence from the Soviet Union. So, of course, I wanted to study the aspirations of my community, my Lithuanian community. And my PhD supervisor at Oxford sat me down and said, Viva, the world does not need a PhD dissertation on how great the Lithuanians are. You're not objective. You're going to fail. Go away, find something else. And so, as a way of understanding my parents' aspirations and my parents' homeland's aspirations, I ended up studying the self-determination aspirations of 26 other communities around the world. And that got me into places, as I said, South Sudan and Eritrea and Kurdistan and Tibet and East Timor, safer places like Quebec and Scotland and Catalonia that also have very strong self-determination aspirations amongst their communities. So it was a little meandering path that got me to this subject, but one that I have deeply, deeply, and passionately enjoyed since that time.
It seems like an amazing career. Like, describe a little more about what you think is missing when you go to some of these places that you feel like are cut off.
I think the way we think about frontlines as isolated, impoverished, and frequently fairly lawless areas, the challenge really is a disconnect from markets. So when I think about business, of course, there's much business going on in terms of merchants and farmers and others that are aspiring to create a better life for themselves. But at some point, you really need to think about, okay, what is the competitive advantage in these places? And it's usually underdeveloped land and very hardworking, low cost labor. What you need in these places is a little bit of capital, some skills, and connections to national markets, local markets, and even international markets. And I think when I say that business is missing, it really is taking small scale and growing that to a place where there really are livelihoods for the local community.
You give an example of the book and the idea that some of the smallest scale farmers don't really have access to competitive market pricing. And a lot of the value is taken away by middlemen. And you talked about you and your students, your class, trying to work on that issue. What were some of the things you learned in going after that problem?
Let me take you through a couple of the lessons that we learned working in frontlines environments. And I'm very happy to use the Uganda example. One of the first things that you learn when you start working in frontlines environments is that you have to follow the money. You have to follow the money across the whole value chain in order to get some sense of the landscape or map of all of the local actors in a frontlines community. This starts, if we're talking about an example in Uganda, in agriculture, everything from the seeds and pesticides and fertilizers, all the way through harvest and transportation. But what we found, and sometimes we learn best from our failures and our mistakes, is we were so thrilled that we could just figure out the value chain and figure out where there was better pricing and better customers and figure out how to work with the local NGO to organize the farmers into cooperatives so that they'd have the economies of scale. And what happened here is we missed the competition. We missed the competition. The competition to these new market dynamics were the old market dynamics, which were the middlemen. And in this particular case, in rural Uganda, far away from Kampala or any urban centers, the middlemen were middlemen with guns. And what had happened is that, this cooperative was having a meeting, and some of the middlemen came and abducted a few of the leaders and held them hostage until they agreed not to proceed, because these new market arrangements were essentially taking away money and power from the middlemen. And so this took a lot of problem solving with the local community and also listening to some of the middlemen. It turns out the middlemen are sons, husbands, uncles, cousins of many of the community that we were working with, many of which wanted to have a respected place in that community. They wanted to marry someone's daughter. They wanted to have their own business. And so the solution that we came up with the local community members is, all right, let's really think about how many of these middlemen do we have to pull into the cooperative such that they will protect the new market dynamics. And it turns out, after doing this 10 or 15 years in a lot of different places like Guatemala and Uganda and Mindanao in the Philippines, the number is surprisingly small. If you get about 25% or 30% of the middlemen, that is enough to actually protect the new market dynamics. Now, in the end, we as outsiders cannot make these decisions for the local community. We can only provide options. And the community itself decided which middlemen to invite into the new market arrangements and give a stake in the cooperative. And fortunately, now the cooperative is working well. They have lots of markets, lots of customers in Kampala. And, this community ended up earning enough money so that when another NGO a couple of years later built a local school, they had enough money for the books and the uniforms and things like that to send their children to the parish school.
Are you interested in the intersection of business and social impact? Do you want to know how corporate sustainability, ESG, impact investing, and more can contribute to development finance? My name is Advas Aldinger. I'm a senior reporter at Devex, and I've been reporting on these issues for nearly a decade. I'm the author of Devex Invested, our free weekly newsletter dedicated to development finance. Every Tuesday, we explore how companies, investors, and market mechanisms are reshaping the world of development finance. Visit devex.com/newsletters and join us on Tuesdays.
Yeah, it's a great example, I think, of what lots of folks who work in this space know about and comment on, and that's just the reality of political economy. And that the naive way to look at the most challenging places in the world is it's a resource problem. Bring in more resources, write a bigger check, donate things, like everything's going to work out. It's a much more complex dynamic that sometimes places are poor in part because there is conflict. As you say, lawlessness. There isn't a governing structure that's easy to engage with, and the political economy is really fraught. And if you don't take that into account, the best intentions, the most resources isn't actually going to create a sustainable solution, right?
And let me just build on your point there. We have interacted with a number of multinational corporations that have already figured out how to do this well. The question of security is always one that comes up as we're talking to senior business leaders. As a partner of a professional services firm said to us once, I don't doubt the size of the opportunity, but middlemen with guns scare me. But let's take an example of Newmont Mining. Newmont Mining is one of the largest gold miners in the world. It's headquartered out of Colorado. And what they have figured out over time is the best way to address issues of security is to have your business be so deeply embedded in the local community that the local community perceives your business as their business, and so they protect it as their own. In some ways, you almost can't buy enough security. You can't build a high enough wall. You can't build a high enough fence to protect these places. As the former CEO of Newmont Mining, Wayne Murdy, would tell us, if a mob wants your mine, the mob will get your mine. There's no way to get it higher enough security. But that being said, if you embed your business very deeply in the local community will then look after your business. And this is a true story of Newmont. Newmont was building a very big gold mine in Ghana, quite far up the coast. And some of its equipment got, quote unquote, stuck in the Accra harbor. Now, even before Newmont could send its lawyers down to the port to, figure out what was going on with this equipment, the village elders and queen mothers from Brangahafo, where this mine is, essentially came down 200 miles down to the Accra harbor and talked to the port authority and said, hey, that equipment is ours. You need to get it through the port, and we need to get it back into Brangahafo so that we can get our mine working. And I think this is the dynamic. Certainly, operationally, it's a little bit more difficult to work with all of these local partners because you have to manage all these relationships. But the benefit in the long term is you get to a point where your business is flourishing and the local community benefits as well.
Yeah, it's a great example, and I thought really timely, just given the rush for critical minerals. It's one of the biggest challenges for the World Bank, for the multilateral development finance agencies, and others. Is how do they encourage responsible investment, responsible global corporate value chains in these places that get access to those critical minerals because everybody needs them, especially in the biggest countries and biggest economies, but that do it in a way that actually drives the kind of development progress everybody wants to see. And I think some of what you're getting at in that story about Newmont and some of the other stories in the book sort of sparked that for me. How do you see where this fits in? Because a lot of it is very small scale, but I think it fits a much larger narrative.
So a couple of things on the front lines that I think we need to understand. First of all, over the last 20 years of globalization, you can think of 20 years since The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman or Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid by C.K. Prahalad. We've had 20 years of globalization and trillions of dollars of investment in India and China. And our contention is within 100 miles of an international airport. So, of course, Colombia, Bogota, Medellin, Cartagena have had a lot of investment. Or even in sub-Saharan Africa, Nairobi is booming. The skyscrapers are going up. But the issue is most of that international investment has stopped within 100 miles of an international airport. And our contention here is the next round of globalization is going to be in these frontlines environments. And so not only is there natural resources here, there's also going to be a great deal of agriculture. And as you think about climate change, we're going to have to grow more stuff in the places that it normally should be growing rather than in enormous plantations that some of our multinational corporations, agricultural corporations, are doing now. And so the second part of our book is really dedicated to international and national companies, the step-by-step process that you're going to have to replicate to be able to work in these sorts of environments, like following the money, like working with a broad range of local partners and finding common ground. There is a severe absence of data in these sorts of places. So you're going to have dirty boots and go out to these places and really understand the dynamics yourselves. And also, finally, fail fast. This is one of those where the feedback loop needs to be very quick in getting feedback to different business models and approaches so that you can succeed in these environments. The contention is that they're similar enough that if you build these skills, you will be able to access this $20 trillion of economic activity in isolated, impoverished, and fairly lawless places. We really think that this is going to be the next round of globalization.
Well, I think you might not be alone in that. And it seems to me like a lot of the global investment in frontline markets is coming from places like China and India and Turkey. Some of these are, adversaries of the U.S. and of the West. How do you think about the way that they are approaching this? Do you see kind of a dichotomy here where some of these other countries and their businesses get it, and the Western companies kind of don't? And are you trying to correct that, or what do you actually see?
So my colleague, Professor Emily Block, and I spend a fair amount of time with the U.S. Army Special Operations Command on exactly this issue. There are a number of generals, and certainly in the Special Forces community, that are very, very worried that the Chinese have essentially figured out how to work in these places. these frontline, impoverished, isolated, and fairly lawless places. What we've been working on with them is to say, look, China has a particular way of going in here, but it's transactional. They bring their own labor. They build shoddy infrastructure. And frankly, if you're in Ghana or you're in Senegal or you're in Colombia, and there's any choice between working with a General Electric or a Newmont Mining versus a Chinese mining company or Chinese infrastructure company, if you do this right, they're going to choose the American company or Western company because we hire locally, we provide training, we provide opportunities, and in some ways, if you combine business and security in these places, it's going to be good for the local communities, and it's also going to be good for American business. But I tell you, there are many in our national security apparatus that are very worried that the Chinese have already figured out how to combine business and economics. Certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, they are beginning in Latin America. They're certainly across Asia. So we think this is a better way, both for American companies who will need access to these resources and for the local communities to have a real partner.
Yeah, I was interested to read in the book that I think you won the highest civilian honor that the U.S. Special Forces gives out, right? To give a sense of how close your work has been with the U.S. military. Why do you think you need this kind of collaboration between national security folks and development community folks? You get into that a little bit in the book, but maybe this is just a good moment to hear it from you.
Please know my first commitment is very much to the international development community. I spent 7 years on the board of directors of Catholic Relief Services. It's one of the largest international humanitarian organizations in the world. And indeed, my own parents were refugees during World War II and were looked after in the refugee camps and on their way to the United States by the precursor of Catholic Relief Services, which is War Relief Services. And so we spent a great deal of time with World Vision, with Mercy Corps, with Save the Children, with Catholic Relief Services, with the Aga Khan Foundation, working in many places in the world, helping them build sustainable businesses so that locals can have a real livelihood and a real shot at a good day's work. That being said, there are certain places that even I, on the board of Catholic Relief Services, would not feel comfortable sending our staff, either because of the particular time, the particular conflict, the particular uncertainty. And that got us to really thinking about who else has a stake in peace in these frontline environments. And as I've been taught by many of my special forces soldiers, no one loves peace more than a soldier. The special operations community is building a set of capabilities to combine economics and security to build stability. To build stability, and stability is good for our long-term national security. It is another way in to improving the conditions in these sorts of places so that people can have the chance to work hard and lift themselves out of poverty. So it wasn't necessarily the path I would have expected. It, once again, fairly meandering, as some of my other previous history has been fairly meandering. But what we have in common is a deep commitment to these places that frankly look just like us if we had not won the demographic lottery. As Warren Buffett says, 90% of our success is the fact that we were born American. If you're in Uganda or you're in Afghanistan, you are just as hardworking. And what we're doing is essentially thinking through the conditions so that you and your family really get a shot at a good day's work.
Hi, I'm Kate Warren, Executive Editor at Devex. If you are listening to this podcast, you are likely working to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But are you subscribed to Devex Newswire? Global development can be a fast-moving, complex sector. our team of global reporters work every day to bring you the news you need to make sense of it all. In Devex Newswire, we keep you up to date on issues ranging from climate change financing to gender equality and global health to transforming the food system, all in a fun-to-read, free newsletter delivered directly to you 5 days a week. Join the hundreds of thousands of global development professionals who receive Devex Newswire and visit devex.com/newsletters to sign up to this free newsletter today.
You mentioned some of the international NGOs that you work with. Do the big international NGOs, the rest of the global development community, do you feel like they get it when it comes to the role of business in these places? Or do you think there's still a disconnect between kind of charitable approaches and the way you think this work ought to happen?
I think it is an evolving conversation between the humanitarian community and the business one. It's certainly not a natural act. It takes quite a bit of time to learn each other's languages, but both really need each other. As you are on the board of Catholic Relief Services and you deal with these questions of even what is the words that we're going to use for our programs? Do we call people beneficiaries? And so is it really about us giving them stuff and they're consumers of our services? Sometimes that happens, and that really breeds dependency. We at Catholic Relief Services had been trying to work to a language of graduates so that if people come through our program, they can stand on their own 2 feet. Now, let's really think about this from basic principles. If I'm going to bet on goodwill or bet on self-interest, I'm going to bet on self-interest any day of the week. So to get to a sustainable position where people have ongoing work, not through programs or projects that are funded by USAID or the Brits or the Norwegians or the Aussies, but real work. You have to create, you have to grow, you have to produce products that are so valuable that your neighbors want to buy them. And they're going to want to buy them on an ongoing basis. And so I think over time, humanitarian organizations are going to have to weave through business processes and principles to get to a sustainable position from their programs. I think business will need to listen to humanitarian organizations who really do understand local communities far better than maybe multinational corporations understand from their headquarters. But regardless, these initiatives are going to be defined from the ground up. I don't care if you're an international humanitarian organization and you're designing a program in some shiny office, or you're a multinational corporation and you're thinking about your investment in your shiny office. Both are going to be wrong. It has to be done in conjunction with local communities based on the local context, the local assets and competitive advantages, and the local needs.
How do you think ESG fits into all of this? That's a different kind of motivation than maybe what the person in the local community wants, which might just be a job. They might not see it from the perspective of ESG. Where do you think it fits in, if at all?
I think multinational corporations have really taken on ESG, and I think those initiatives are commendable. That being said, the only place that this works on a long-term sustainable way is that if it's an advantage to the company and it's an advantage to the community. So for example, let's take Green Mountain Coffee. Green Mountain Coffee for many, many years has taken a look at the entire value chain and only keep those steps where they really have a competitive advantage, which is quality control and access to customers. And what they've done is they've essentially partnered everything else. They partner with small coffee farmers. They partner with small cooperatives and traders. They partner with Catholic Relief Services to provide some of the agricultural techniques that are needed and use of water. They partner with Root Capital for microfinance for these farmers. And they get really good quality coffee. And I'll tell you, working in Guatemala where there's some of the best coffee in the world, if there's a drought, or if there is a hurricane, or if there's any other disruption in supply of coffee, because Green Mountain Coffee has been so good to those local farmers and those local cooperatives, if there's any going to be a choice of who to sell to, they're going to sell the Green Mountain Coffee. And so Green Mountain Coffee is both making a profit and improving the lives of local farmers because it's good for business. To me, that is the operational approach that is going to be the really sustainable and competitive advantage.
Yeah, to me, that was one of the interesting insights from your book, this idea that for a lot of global corporates or investors, when they hear about these markets, they might think, oh, this is scary, men with guns, do I really want to be involved there? And it comes down mostly to those two things you just mentioned, quality control and access to large customers. And that's a really different way of looking at it, certainly than maybe some of the competitors among, say, Chinese companies who, as you described earlier, are kind of doing soup to nuts, right? They're coming in, they're building things themselves with their own labor. You're saying, hey, actually, you can play in this market, but in a very different way. And I thought that was a really interesting insight from the book.
What we're saying is, if you take a look at an entire value chain, take agriculture as an example, people have mitigated the risk of frontline environments in a number of different ways. You certainly have the Dole plantation approach, Dole being the largest landowner in Guatemala, where they have everything, as you said, the Chinese, but also Dole and others, soup to nuts. They grow everything, they harvest everything, they pack everything, they ship everything, it comes to your doorstep as a consumer. That has a very high upfront investment cost. The way we see things is like the Green Mountain Coffee approach. Far lower upfront investment costs, because I'm not buying land, I'm not building structures, I'm not doing any of this. I may have a higher operational cost because I'm managing quite a few local partners, which could be cooperatives or traders or local farmers. But overall, the return on investment capital works and the mitigation of risk works because you're not taking the really big upfront investment cost. You're actually taking it as an operational cost over time. And so the return on invested capital then begins to look differently in these frontline environments.
I can see how that works in agriculture, but does it apply, for example, in extractive industries, right? We talked before about how mining is going to be so important in many of the lowest income countries in the world. Can you take this kind of approach in that industry?
Each industry, of course, will disaggregate its value chain in a different way. But let us take Newmont Mining as an example versus some of its competitors. Newmont Mining in Ghana has one of the largest gold mines in the world. They have 1,500 employees, and although at the beginning they had quite a few expatriates, now they run the whole mine with only 3. What does that mean? That means that they have essentially started the training programs and the like to train locals to run the mine. So the mining engineers, the metallurgists, the survey, the welders, the truck drivers, and things like that. They have also pushed all of the supplying down to local companies. So whether it be uniforms or food or housing or anything else that's needed. So they have essentially created an ecosystem around the mine that is very vibrant, that is almost entirely run by Ghanaians for Ghanaians. So whether you do it in agriculture or you do it in mining or you do it in infrastructure, there's a number of different ways in order to such that the local community participates, works very hard for their living, but gets an opportunity to be part of this industry. And frankly, if you think about it, mining is usually one of the first industrial activities that many of these places ever see. And if you do mining right, a lot of other things follow. right? Because then people have income, then there's demand for financial institutions, for telecom, for internet, for consumer goods, for a number of other things. It kickstarts the flywheel of economic development. And let me just add one more thing to your sort of mental thought process. This comes from research done by Paul Collier. You may know him from The Bottom Billion. So what he did is he just took a look at sort of a hectare of land in Europe versus a hectare of land in sub-Saharan Africa. And as it turns out, a hectare of land, in terms of the raw materials that are extracted from it in Europe, is worth about $125,000. It's worth about $25,000 in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, if you think about it, there's no reason for geology for that to be so different. What it really means is that in many of these frontline places, the natural resources are underdeveloped, and that there's a really long way to go in order to continue to develop those for the benefit of our global economy and also for the benefit of the local communities.
So just as we start to wrap up, I'm just curious what you would say to some of the multilateral development banks, some of the development finance institutions, some of the NGOs that see this trend too. They want to play in this space because they say this is a huge opportunity. It's that nexus of all the things you're talking about: national security, global economic security, development success, sustainable development success, social impact. And they see this big opportunity. You're looking at this very much from the big corporate standpoint, I feel like, and from the perspective of your business school students. But there's so many other players in the space. What would you say to all of those other players?
I think for all the other players, point number one is we're going to have to take the front line seriously because it's just too big and too underdeveloped to be overlooked for too much longer. I think that's sort of point number one. I think point number two is business and multilateral organizations are going to have to partner to get this right because there's lots of ways you can screw it up, right? Many ways. You're going to have to build new skills and capabilities that we haven't had in the past because we haven't needed it. Think about making business decisions now, in the United States or in Western Europe. We have so much data, we don't even know what to do with the data, right? To make business decisions. Now imagine you're a multinational agricultural company or you're an infrastructure company and you're really looking at these places where there is a paucity of data, right? You're going to have to train a cadre of folks that are going to be very comfortable putting on dirty boots and spending time problem solving in these places, building local relationships, finding common ground, and thinking about what's going to be the first step here? What's going to be the second step here? How do we iterate quickly, fail fast, and fail forward? I think that's a different skill set. And I'm pretty sure we're not teaching that in business schools yet. I certainly know our business school is only at the tip of starting to think about how to teach these sorts of skills. So what you're going to need is you're going to need business with its drive to profitability and sustainability. You're going to need capital, which is going to come from the multilaterals. And both of these are going to have to take on a different mindset, which is going to be one of partnership. It's going to be slower. It's going to be messier. It's going to be tougher, right? There's no easy way of saying this. If it had been easy, someone had done it, which is why my co-author, Emily Block, and I always talk about this as not being business as usual. But my overarching message is there is a very, very large opportunity. And if we don't get there, others will.
Reading your book, Viva, made me want to be a student in the business on the front lines. And the book, I think, is really rich with examples and insights that you've learned in your career doing this work, teaching this work. And I appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation today. It's great to meet you.
Thank you very much. It has really been an honor. Thank you very much.
Viva Ona Bartkus is Professor Emerita at Notre Dame's Mendoza College of Business. She and Emily Block are the co-authors of Business on the Edge.
Thank you all for joining. If you like the podcast, please share with your friends and give us 5 stars. And we really do want to hear from you. Please leave your thoughts in the comments or send me a message on Twitter at Raj_Devex. To learn what we're reading next, make suggestions for future guests, or submit questions for authors, be sure to sign up for our Devex Book Club mailing list, which you can find in the description of the show wherever you're listening to this. If you care about global development issues and you want the latest news, don't forget to subscribe to the Devex Newswire at the link in the comments, where you'll get the day's top global development breaking news, analysis, and opinion, as well as the date of the next book club. Until then, do good out there, and thanks for joining.